50 years ago tonight, on the Jewish calendar, as the sun set on the eve of Yom Kippur 1973, the fate of Israel lay very much in the balance, although very few appreciated just how precarious that balance truly was. Few could anticipate how grievous the losses would be in what came to be known as the Yom Kippur War, and how close that high holiday season came to being the last for the state of Israel. Tonight on Kol Nidre Eve 2023, it is a very different Israel, it is a very different world, but I would propose that there is a fundamental lesson that we learn from the events of 50 years ago. It is easy tonight to wag fingers at our cousins in Israel then or now, and in fact I will. But I would suggest that we have the same lessons to learn ourselves. Whether as friends of Israel, as members of the American Jewish community, as members of this B'nai Torah community, or even just as individuals seeking repentance and a better way for 5784, we would do well to learn the lesson of overconfidence. Now, it is appropriate to have confidence in yourself. It's okay even to be brave, to recognize that you are taking a risk. And then you can judge, is the reward worth it? The problem is that when you assume that success is guaranteed, that you have it in the bag. An early lead can lead you to assume that all you need to do is coast to victory. As the Atlanta Falcons proved, I don't know what a safe lead is, but it is not 28-3. One of the most essential themes of the book of Deuteronomy that we've been reading these past months in synagogue every Saturday morning is to beware of unwarranted confidence. And I'll offer just a couple of examples, a few passages. Deuteronomy 8 anticipates that the Israelites will be blessed with homes, with plentiful harvests, accrue possessions and fertile flocks. And they reach that level of success, they might say, I accomplished all this with the strength of my own hands, and not recognizing the role that God's blessing had in their success. It's okay to have faith, to trust that God has something good in store for you. The problem is when you take for granted that you are entitled to the specific blessing you want. And leaders run a special risk of overconfidence. In chapter 17 of Deuteronomy, you are warned that when the Israelites choose a king, that king might become obsessed with the trappings of power, become haughty, amassing harem and horses, and lose sight of responsibilities to the detriment of an entire nation. And in chapter 29, Moses warns, an individual might hear the words of this warning and bless himself in his heart and say, Ki b'shrirut libi elech. I will have peace and success even if I go do whatever I want. Sweeping away, the Torah says, Laman sfot harava tatzme'ah. Sweeping away the wet with the dry. That the person's refusal to heed those warnings will bring disaster not just upon themselves, but upon the entire community. It is all too easy to assume that one's past accomplishments are a guarantee of future success, that we are, if you will, too big to fail. The 2008 financial crisis was all about bankers and hedge funds making risky bets that ended with a lot of other people losing homes and livelihoods. And that falling victim to overconfidence is what happened in Israel 50 years ago tonight. But to understand why that happened 50 years ago, in 1973, I have to set the Wayback Machine back 6 more years to 6 days in 1967. In 1967, Israel was so vulnerable and outnumbered and just 9 miles wide. But the 6-day war changed all of that. The Israeli forces overwhelmed a numerically superior enemy and created a strategically defensible border. Jews again had access to our holy sites, creating a fervor that destiny was on our side, that the days of the Messiah might indeed be close at hand. And that confidence had only faded slightly in 1973. On Kol Nidre Eve 50 years ago, If you had asked the average Israeli, or even, by the way, many of Israel's military strategists, whether they were concerned about the possibility of war, they would have poo-pooed the possibility. Israel's leaders were confident that they had technical superiority over their enemies. The joke was that Egyptian tanks had 4 gears, and 3 of them were reverse. They believed that they had superior intelligence gathering that would give them several days' warning of an attack, enough time to mobilize their reserves and reinforce their borders. There was an underlying belief that the Arabs could not win and knew it, and that therefore they would not attack. Unfortunately, no one told the Arabs that. And so the commonly told story of the war, though, is that it was a complete surprise. But Israel's leaders had plenty of warning. King Hussein of Jordan told them everything but the date of the attack. The Mossad, the secret service, alerted them as well. But Israeli strategists discounted those warnings as just another false alarm. And as it became clear that an attack was indeed imminent, Golda Meir, the prime minister, considered a preemptive strike of the type that won the war for them in 1967, but she rejected it because it would have led to the loss of American support, which they knew was Israel's fail-safe. She authorized a small-scale mobilization of forces, but it was too little, too late. Israel did not realize, by the way, that it had lost a key technological advantage. Russia had equipped Syrian and Egyptian forces with new, more sophisticated systems, anti-aircraft, anti-tank. There's a movie, Golda, that is finishing its run in theaters that offers a vivid, even if sometimes dramatized view of those days. On the afternoon of Yom Kippur, Syrian and Egyptian forces quickly overran Israeli positions, and the wildly outnumbered Israelis suffered heavy losses. The enemy quickly knocked out 1/3 of Israel's air force and hundreds of its tanks with these new weapons that Israel did not even know they had. Top leaders contemplated amongst themselves that perhaps this Yom Kippur was the end of the Jewish state. Moshe Dayan really did consider blowing up the bridges over the Jordan as a last line of defense. And Israel's nuclear weapons, which they did not have, were brought online as a last resort. And Israel's reliance on the United States government was not all it was cracked up to be. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon were concerned about the repercussions of Arabs withholding their oil, of Saudi Arabia and OPEC boycotting anyone who supported Israel. And it was only 6 days into the war that the U.S. government finally did come through with Operation Nickel Grass, sending 567 flights with 20,000 tons of supplies. Many historians think that the reason for this delay of support was that they wanted the Egyptians and the Syrians to have a taste of victory and for Israel to suffer, Israel to get a black eye, so that the moods of Egyptian and Israeli leaders might change to one that would be more likely to foster an agreement. And apparently Nixon and Kissinger were right, because giving the Egyptians the feeling that they had finally won one set in motion Sadat's visit to Jerusalem in 1977 and the King David Accords signed just a year later. The legacy of those accords is a 45-year-long peace between those two countries that is kind of like a marriage in a depressing Russian novel. Long-lasting, if not particularly warm or enthusiastic. But it is not for me to say if that reward is worth the cost, because that cost was paid not just in tanks and planes. It is paid in graves visited on every Yom HaZikaron, every Israel Memorial Day. Now, it is very easy to pick on Israel's leader in hindsight. Almost as soon as the war was over, there was a commission impaneled, the Agranat Commission, which ultimately, after interviewing many people involved, decided to assign blame to specific leaders and exonerate others. But the truth is, none of us wants to hear bad news. None of us wants to think that we will not beat the odds. And among those leaders who miscalculated that day were the same ones who were so strategically powerful in winning in 1967. They made mistakes of wishful thinking. Sometimes even the greatest experts overestimate their expertise. So what should we say for everyone else? Part of our cognitive bias is that we don't know what we don't know. There's a phenomenon you may have heard of called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's commonly understood to mean that people who are not particularly good at something tend to rate themselves more highly than might be justified. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but basically you are so bad at something you don't actually realize that you're bad at it. And meanwhile, the people who are truly the best at something have a certain humility. They notice the small gaps in their performance that leave them just short of perfection. So Dunning-Kruger can be very entertaining to watch. There are currently several hundred talent competitions available on the various streaming services to which we subscribe. There's American Idol, there's The Voice, The X Factor, So You Think You Can Dance. And I really think, just like they now have the Jewish Matchmaker show, that we could narrowcast a little bit further. So we could have So You Think You Can Daven, America's Got Cantors, Gefilte Fish Tank, RuPaul's Drosh Race, The Great Yiddish Bake Off, or America's Next Top Moel. Gives a whole new meaning to Take Your Knives and Go. I am glad you thought that was good. I might have a touch of Dunning-Kruger myself. Now, by the way, what makes those shows entertaining, the reason why people watch the first rounds, the producers very intentionally will seed the first rounds with people who are genuinely awful. But their overconfidence leads them to believe that they are among the elite. And watching them crash and burn makes for great TV. But in real life, it's not as good when it shows up in airline pilots or doctors, or dare I say, politicians. So today, Israel faces a different test of overconfidence. A year ago, at the dawn of 1583, Israel had many things going for it. Israel is an economic powerhouse. It has a dramatic strategic advantage in military technology and intelligence. And the situation with the Palestinians has settled into an uneasy status quo, punctuated by occasional terror attacks which are horrific on their own, but not an existential threat. And more importantly, much of the Arab world is willing to move ahead on peace with Israel, whether or not the Palestinian leadership chooses to participate. The Abraham Accords have opened tremendous opportunities, with even further opportunities for peace and collaboration on the horizon. However, Deuteronomy tells us that it is at our moments of greatest confidence that we run the risk of our greatest failure. The Israeli elections of November 2022 were the fifth they have in 5 years. That's even more than we have for a Georgia Senate seat. Now, Israel's left-wing parties miscalculated. They thought that they could all run separately, but as a result, the way Israel's vote systems work, they were short 60,000 votes and lost 5 seats in the Knesset. Several right-wing parties merged and were able to reap the benefit. And as a result, Prime Minister Netanyahu was able to cobble together a narrow majority that relied on Israel's most right-wing parties, relying on the goodwill of extremists to stay in power. And the result has been some of the deepest divides ever seen in Israeli society. So when you look at the coalition, every party has different agendas. For the ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties, it is about funding of their institutions. It's about ensuring that the members of their community do not have to serve in the army. and making their particular version of Jewish law the law of the land. I have no standing to complain about who does or doesn't serve in the Israeli army because I didn't. And I have no beef with Jews who want to observe halakha, Jewish law, Jewish practice in the most strict way. And in fact, I agree with them that in Israel, the law must be structured in a way that those who want to observe in the most rigorous of ways have the ability and the right to do so. Where I part ways is demanding that the law impose those same values and that particular approach on everyone else. There are other challenges. There are those who are calling for the annexation of the West Bank. So in 1967, when Israel conquered the West Bank, they made a strategic decision not to annex it. They said, Jerusalem is part of Israel. We're going to hold off on everything else. The hope was that borders would be drawn, that someday the Palestinians would come up with a competent self-government that would allow Jews to keep living next door in the places that are historically meaningful to us. And so as long as that's the plan, it's not a violation of international law for Israel to administer that area temporarily. But when you declare that as your intent to drive out the people who live there or make them stateless residents of your country, then you are threatening to bring truth to some of the worst lies that Israel's enemies tell about it. Those issues run together around something called judicial reform. Here and now, I will not go into all the details, but in essence, Israel has no constitution, Israel has no Bill of Rights, and so the courts are sort of the brake on what is considered reasonable or not. And often, the rights of minorities, conservative and Reform Jews, gay and lesbian Jews, whoever it might be, are walled off, are conserved by the court. And there is an attempt in place to undo those protections. So members of the coalition believe that they can ram those changes through without consequence. As Deuteronomy says, Ki b'shrirut libi elech. I'll do as I wish. But for over 40 straight weeks, tens and hundreds of thousands of Israelis have come out to protest. And I had the chance to spend some time with our protesters there. And I have to say that these are not anti-Israel protests. These are not anti-Zionist protests. These are people who proudly carry Israeli flags. These are people who serve in the army. These are families that have made the ultimate sacrifice of a father, a brother, a son, or a daughter. These are not radical leftists. These are members of Bibi's own Likud who have become disillusioned that perhaps the reason why the courts are being undone is to allow the undoing of charges against members of the government. Israel's civil society is breaking down as we watch. Israeli Air Force pilots are among the most highly trained in the world, and a lot of them are wondering if there is still time to eject safely. Business leaders are concerned that these new rules will make it easier for government officials to get away with corruption and bribery. Watchdogs in the government would be removed or made into political appointees. And there are already many Israel-based startups and multinationals that have stood by Israel, but are now wondering whether they should reduce their investments. I was on a call with a Palestinian activist who said, you know, I have never been such a big fan of Bibi. The BDS movement should send him flowers and a cake because he has done more to discourage investment in Israel than anything we have tried. Part of the challenge is that Israel is not a country unto itself. And so a conversation took place just on Friday between Netanyahu and members of the American Jewish community, leaders across the spectrum. And the question that Bibi faces is whether or not he can write off the segments of the American Jewish community that feel cut out by what is happening. So I will say here and now that I will not turn on Israel. I think it is a fair bet that most people in this room have at least one 21st century American president that you did not like. Not even one little bit. And the only thing that you all disagree about is whether it was this one or that one who was the worst. And I'm also willing to bet that it was the guy who you didn't like was running things, that you were probably even more worried about our country when the guy you did like was running things. Unless you didn't like either of them, in which case you're just worried all the time. And I think that's how we have to think about Israel as well. So unlike some of my colleagues, I will not stop saying the prayer for Israel. I will not stop praying for Israel's government to be blessed with wisdom. But I can't stop folks from feeling differently. So I had an experience this past spring where I brought a group from our Atlanta Federation to pray at the Kotel. And there is a section of the Kotel that is set aside for Jews who want to pray together, men and women together as we do. That area is poorly maintained, and you can't find the prayer books. And others have had worse experiences where the services were disrupted by rioters while the police on government orders stood by. And if that happens to your group, you might say, maybe the next time we go to a desert and take a risk, it's going to be Vegas. So earlier this year, Israel's Minister for Diaspora Affairs was photographed apparently giving the finger to Jews at the New York Israel Day Parade. Now, he claims the photo was poorly timed, that in fact he was just saying hook 'em horns, but he had already given them the finger, metaphorically speaking. He is supposed to be with the head that the reform movement is terrible. If you go up against the people you're trying to connect with, they might not connect with you. In 1973, when Moshe Dayan thought it was the end for Israel, Golda Meir got on the phone with Henry Kissinger and said, you know, I'll just come to the United States and the American Jewish community will turn the tide. Israel is much stronger now than it was then. But Israel's leaders are capable of scoring an own goal, of creating a rift in the Jewish people that is just potentially as dangerous. But overconfidence, by the way, is not just limited to that side of the Atlantic over there. So our American Jewish community is one of the most successful, established, creative, secure, wealthy of all times. Or so we tell ourselves. But if you look at the great Jewish communities of history, all of them had an expiration date. The golden age of Spain lasted a good few hundred years. The Jews of Germany had it going pretty well until they didn't. For a while, American Jewish pundits were worried about the risks of assimilation, but it turns out that good old-fashioned hate is giving it a run for its money. Everyone here in Atlanta, I'm sure, is familiar with the incidents this year with anti-Semitic leaflets placed in driveways, neo-Nazi rallies in front of synagogues, bomb threats that have disrupted services in 40 synagogues or more across the country. But this is not just some lunatic fringe. 2 weeks ago, I sat down with our BT Lab students, their 7th graders, and I asked them how many of them had experienced anti-Semitism from their classmates in local public schools in Fulton, DeKalb, Cobb counties. Just about every hand went up. And I asked them, so what did you do? And many of them said, you know, I didn't want to say anything to the administration because it was pretty clear that they would not be sympathetic. On college campuses, anti-Semitism hides in plain sight behind criticism of Israel. This weekend, the University of Pennsylvania is hosting an anti-Israel conference. Leading up to it, a student entered Hillel, knocking over furniture and yelling anti-Semitic slogans. No relation. And by the way, a fractured civil discourse is only making things worse. I honestly don't know who is winning the culture wars, but it is not us. It is not a competition whether it is worse that someone banned the Diary of Anne Frank from a school library because it's too woke, or someone banned Jews from a campus club because we are colonizers. This past year, there were leaders in our community. I recognize Esther Panich in our midst, who tried to get a bill passed called HB 30 that would have made it easier to charge violence or discrimination against Jews as a hate crime. That legislation was scuttled, and there are folks on both sides of the aisle who should be ashamed of themselves. There are 4 words that everyone loves to hear in a sermon. And so, in conclusion, false alarm. There are 4 that you cannot say in a sermon. You should vote for. So let me offer a different formulation. Make sure that whoever you support knows how important, how life or death this issue is for our community. There's this classic rabbinic temptation to hold forth on the problems of the world, to give a sermon ripped from the op-ed page. And I want to look a little closer to home and talk about synagogue life and the dangers of overconfidence in our own house. Jason shared with you tonight how much we have to be proud of as a congregation that has doubled in size. We are running 6 different services tonight, plus all the people who are watching on Zoom and stream. We are there for people on the best days, on the worst days of their lives. Preschool is thriving. BT Lab is doing amazing. I'm proud that we are a major feeder to Jewish day schools and camps like Ramah. So much great stuff is going on. We're having an impact in the larger community. People have heard of us in a good way. But Deuteronomy warns us not to assume that success is guaranteed. Lots of congregations once thought of themselves as flagships and have fallen off that perch. Kodak was once the most important in business in the camera industry. So here's what keeps me awake at night. Aside from existential threats to the Jewish people and the fact that I have, as of about an hour ago, 13,197 unread emails. We have a lot to do, my friends. There's a lot to do in the realm of ritual. We've doubled in size, but our daily minyan is no bigger than it was. We pride ourselves on being a congregation that is led by our people, but we need to expand our core of Torah readers and service leaders. We need to help people feel more welcome and connected. We need ushers and greeters. We need people to lead small groups. We've been rebuilding our youth programs from the ground up, but we are not doing enough to keep our teens connected after B'nai Mitzvah, and that's why Rabbi K moved from the role that he was in. He gets up every morning, and one of the things that he does is try to help us figure out how to keep our teens more connected. We're piloting new ways of learning for adults, new kinds of lunch and learn, new learning in people's homes. But it has to actually work. And by the way, that's the short list. I don't sleep much. So tonight I would ask you not to take for granted that B'nai Torah is too big to fail, that we will be fine no matter what you do. Your actions influence the whole. Maybe if you look at your Kol Nidre card, you're in a position to help us fund a new staff position or create a new program by folding out a tab that's one lower than the thought you were going to. Or maybe that's not how you're in a position to help, but maybe you can, when you get that email that's once a month that says, please come help make a minyan, you come. Or maybe you join a synagogue skills class or a Hebrew class, or you host a group in your home. I've reflected tonight on a lot of things to worry about, on the dangers of overconfidence relating to this date in history, to our world Jewish community, to our own little corner of it. But in conclusion, and this time I mean it, on this night of Kol Nidre, I want to reflect on what that means for us as individuals at a season of repentance. The very essence of Kol Nidre, the prayer that we sang and said and read tonight, is that sometimes we overestimate our willpower. Sometimes our mouths write checks that our souls can't cash. We make promises not realizing that their fulfillment is just beyond our grasp. I think sometimes we overestimate our ability to resist temptation. I mentioned earlier that Deuteronomy says that the king should not multiply wives, lest they lead him astray. Solomon, supposedly the wisest of kings, had hundreds of wives, hundreds of mothers-in-law, by the way, drawn from the nations surrounding. And the book of Kings tells us, pulling no punches, that those foreign wives led him to sin. He knew the law, but he felt that he knew better. We are capable of all kinds of rationalization. On Yom Kippur, the key narrative is that of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. His performance of rituals in the Holy of Holies brought about atonement for an entire nation. The Talmud tractate Brachot tells us that Yochanan the high priest served for 80 years, and then only at the end became a heretic. He assumed that he had done enough good that at the end, whatever path he chose must by definition be right. At each moment in our lives, we are offered choices, and we pick wrong ones because we put ourselves in positions where the wrong choice is too close within reach. We make the wrong choices because we assume that we are smarter than everyone else and we won't get caught. We make the wrong choices because we feel like, well, you know what? We've earned it. On this Yom Kippur, 50 years after Israel, after the Jewish people almost lost everything, each of our lives, as they are on every Yom Kippur, are in the balance. And so I ask us to adopt a sense of realism before it is imposed upon us. We have to ask whether we have put the trust in our perceptions justly or wrongly. Can we detect our own Dunning-Kruger? Do we know what it is that we don't know? Is it possible that we are so lost that we don't even realize how lost we are and that we need to ask for directions? The process of tshuva, the process of repentance, begins with self-doubt, with recognizing that we can't be sure we are right until we can honestly consider whether we might just be wrong. Acknowledging uncertainty is not a lack of perfection, but the first step towards it. Of that, I am quite confident. Gmar Chatima Tova, wish us a year of being sealed in the book of life.